Welcome to the garden. Thank you for joining me. My name is Brianna. This is going to be a 1-hour show on Monday nights dedicated to the pursuit of beauty and truth. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And yet, how universal so many beauties are, aren't they? Sunsets seem to be universally thought to be beautiful. A stunning pair of blue eyes, generally thought beautiful. And apparently, if Instagram is any indication for us, a beautifully plated dinner is kind of universally beloved. Well, someone else who I think is universally beloved, is George MacDonald, who is one of the greatest authors of the last century. So tonight I'm going to be reading for you The Light Princess, one of George MacDonald's fairy tales. I've taken the liberty of abridging it for the broadcast, and I do hope I can finish it in my time slot tonight, although I had the good fortune of running into the KTEX station manager who said, if I go over into the 9 o'clock hour, that is fine. Lucky you, lucky me. But hopefully I can get it done within the hour. I hope George will forgive me for my abridgments. I hope I haven't ruined the charm of the book. Anyway, I already said George MacDonald was one of the finest authors of the last century. He was briefly a minister, but his sermons were not well liked. He generally preached about God's universal love and God's ability to redeem anyone. People didn't like that, so his salary was cut in half and he quit his job, which is fortuitous for us. Oh, I've lost my music. I'm not sure. Oh, I hit the space bar with my elbow. Please excuse me. On my last few broadcasts, I pointed out that I'm a first-time broadcaster. This is my third time broadcasting. Can you believe it? Yes, you can. Because I hit the music with I turned off the music with my elbow. Anyway, back to George MacDonald. George MacDonald often was called the father of fantasy and is perhaps best known for The Princess and the Goblin, which you, dear reader, may have heard of. George said, "I write not for children, but for the childlike, whether they be 5 or 50 or 75. I liked that quote. I would love to be thought childlike. I am always yearning to get back to those first days of childhood. My husband says there's no music in the mix. There it is. Did I get it? Not sure. Okay, well, struggling along here this night. Struggling along. Not really sure why there's no music in the mix. Was able to hear it, can't hear it now. Not sure what is happening. Please forgive me, listeners. Let's see if we can get it back in there. Nope. Okay, maybe it's been there all along. It's the buttons. There are many buttons. Many buttons. Maybe I need to bring in my husband with me every Monday night to get it straight. Maybe this will be the last time that I have these struggles. Okay, so poor George, he's not getting a spotlight tonight because it's just me. Just me messing around. Okay, back to George. So he said, I'm going to just go ahead and repeat that quote. I write not for children, but for the childlike, whether they be of 5 or 50 or 75. And I love that because I would love to think that I'm childlike. And maybe even if I'm not, that there is a book or there are writings that could take me back to that place of childlike wonder is good news for me, because that is always what I'm hoping to find. Just that wonderful magic of childhood. So George influenced many great writers of this century, Elizabeth Yates said his work, quote, moved me the way books did when, as a child, the great gates of literature began to open and first encounters with noble thoughts and utterances were unspeakably thrilling. I love that. Remember that feeling? Oh my. I think that the other music background broke in upon me. Maybe I should turn mine up a little bit. Gosh, I'm struggling tonight. Thank you for your patience, dear listener. Be ye listening out there. So G.K. Chesterton, the famous crime writer, said that a George MacDonald book had made a difference to, quote, his whole existence. I mean, what a compliment. If that doesn't make you, dear listener, want to dive into some George MacDonald, I don't know what would. But finally, C.S. Lewis wrote that after a few hours of reading MacDonald, he knew he'd, quote, crossed a great frontier. Wow. Beautiful. So, The Light Princess. Not necessarily upheld as one of George's greatest works, but it is hopefully short enough for this broadcast. And also, nevertheless, maybe not one of his greatest works. Nevertheless, a fun book. I read it for the first time when I was probably 31, so quite old, actually. And I know that it was in the time when I was living in the RV traveling around Europe. I remember laying in that little canopy bed, just in ecstasies, enjoying it, and wondering why I'd never heard it before. So, lest you feel the same when you read it, I will read it for you now. The Light Princess by George MacDonald, Chapter 1. What? No children? Once upon a time, so long ago that I have quite forgotten the date, in a kingdom called Lagobel, there lived a king and queen who had no children. And the king said to himself, all the queens of my acquaintance have children, some 3, some 7, some as many as 12, and my queen has not one? I feel ill-used. So he made up his mind to be cross with his wife about it. But she bore it like a good, patient queen, as she was. Then the king grew very cross indeed. But the queen pretended to take it all as a joke, and a very good one, too. Why don't you have any daughters at least, he said. I don't say sons. That might be too much to expect. I'm sure, dear king, I am very sorry, said the queen. So you ought to be, retorted the king. You are not going to make a virtue of that, surely. But he was not an ill-tempered king, and in any matter of less moment he would have let the queen have her own way with all his heart. This, however, was an affair of state. The queen smiled. You must have patience with a lady, you know, dear king, she said. She was indeed a very nice queen, and heartily sorry that she could not oblige the king immediately. Chapter 2. Won't I just? The king tried to have patience, but he succeeded very badly. It was more than he deserved, therefore, when, at last, the queen gave him a daughter, as lovely as a little princess as ever cried. The day drew near when the infant must be christened. The king wrote all the invitations with his own hand. Of course, somebody was forgotten. Now, it does not generally matter if someone is forgotten, only you must mind who. Unfortunately, the king forgot without intending to, and so the chance fell upon the Princess Make-em-know-it, which was awkward, for the princess was the king's own sister, and he ought not to have forgotten her. But she made herself so disagreeable to the old king, their father, that he had forgotten her in making his will. And so it was no wonder that her brother forgot her in writing his invitations. She was a sour, spiteful creature. The wrinkles of contempt crossed the wrinkles of peevishness, and made her face as full of wrinkles as a pat of butter. If ever a king could be justified in forgetting anybody, this king was justified in forgetting his sister, even at a christening. She looked very odd, too. Her forehead was as large as all the rest of her face, and projected over it like a precipice. When she was angry, her little eyes flashed blue. When she hated anybody, they shone yellow and green. But What made it highly imprudent in the king to forget her was that she was awfully clever. In fact, she was a witch, and when she bewitched anybody, he very soon had enough of it. For she beat all the wicked fairies in wickedness and all the clever ones in cleverness. She despised all the modes we read of in history in which offended fairies and witches have taken their revenge, and therefore, after waiting and waiting in vain for an invitation, she made up her mind at last to go without one and make the whole family miserable, like a princess as she was. So she put on her best gown, went to the palace, was kindly received by the happy monarch, who forgot that he had forgotten her, and she took her place in the procession to the royal chapel. When they were all gathered about the font, she contrived to get next to it, and throwing something into the water, after which she maintained a very respectful demeanor, till the water was applied to the child's face. But at that moment she turned around in her place 3 times and muttered the following words, loud enough for those beside her to hear. "Light of spirit, by my charms, light of body, every part. Never weary human arms, only crush thy parents' heart." They all thought she had lost her wits, and was repeating some foolish nursery rhyme. But a shudder went through the whole of them notwithstanding. The baby, on the contrary, began to laugh and crow, while the nurse gave a start and a smothered cry, for she thought she was struck with paralysis. She could not feel the baby in her arms, but she clasped it tight and said nothing. The mischief was done. Chapter 3, She Can't Be Ours. Her atrocious aunt had deprived the child of all her gravity. The first awkwardness that resulted from this unhappy privation was that the moment the nurse began to float the baby up and down, the baby flew from her arms towards the ceiling. Happily, the resistance of the air brought her ascending career to a close within a foot of it. There she remained, horizontal, as when she left her nurse's arms, kicking and laughing amazingly. The nurse, in terror, flew to the bell and begged the footman who answered it to bring up the house steps directly. Trembling in every limb, she climbed upon the steps and had to stand upon the very top and reach up before she could catch the floating tail of the baby's long clothes. When the strange fact came to be known, there was a terrible commotion in the palace. The occasion of its discovery by the king was naturally a repetition of the nurse's experience. Astonished that he felt no weight when the child was laid in his arms, he began to wave her up and down, and not down, for she slowly ascended to the ceiling as before, and there remained floating in perfect comfort and satisfaction, as was testified by her peals of tiny laughter. The king stood staring in speechless amazement, and trembled so that his beard shook, like grass in the wind. At last, turning to the queen, who was just as horror-struck as himself, he said, gasping, staring, and stammering, "She can't be ours, queen!" Now, the queen was much cleverer than the king, and had already begun to suspect that this defective came by cause. "I am sure she is ours," answered she, "but we ought to have taken better care of her at the christening. People who were never invited ought not to have been present." "Oh ho," said the king, tapping his forehead with his forefinger. "I have it all. I've found her out. Don't you see it, queen? Princess Make-em-Know-It has bewitched her." "That's just what I say," answered the queen. "I beg your pardon, my love. I did not hear you. John, bring the steps I get on my throne with." For he was a little king with a great throne, like many other kings. The throne steps were brought and set up upon the dining table, and John got upon the top of them, but he could not reach the little princess, who lay like a baby laughter cloud in the air, exploding continuously. "Take the tongs, John," said his majesty, and getting on the table, he handed them to him. John could reach the baby now, and the little princess was handed down by the tongs. Chapter 4, Where is she? One fine summer day, a month after these first adventures, during which time she had been very carefully watched, the princess was lying on the bed in the queen's own chamber, fast asleep. One of the windows was open, for it was noon, and the day was so sultry that the little girl was wrapped in nothing less ethereal than slumber itself. The queen came into the room, and not observing that the baby was on the bed, opened another window. A frolicsome fairy wind, which had been watching for a chance of mischief, rushed in at the one window, taking its way over to the bed where the child was lying, caught her up, and rolling and floating her along like a piece of flue or a dandelion seed, carried her with it through the opposite window and away. The queen went downstairs, quite ignorant of the loss she had herself occasioned. When the nurse returned, she supposed that Her Majesty had carried her off, and dreading a scolding, delayed making inquiry about her. But hearing nothing, she grew uneasy, and went at length to the Queen's boudoir, where she found Her Majesty. Please, Your Majesty, shall I take the baby?" she said. "Where is she?" asked the Queen. Please forgive me, I know it was wrong." "What do you mean?" asked the Queen, looking grave. "Oh, don't frighten me, Your Majesty," exclaimed the nurse, clasping her hands. The Queen saw that something was amiss and fell down in a faint. The nurse rushed about the palace screaming, "My baby! My baby!" Everyone ran into the Queen's room, but the Queen could give no orders. They soon found out, however, that the princess was missing, and in a moment the palace was like a beehive in a garden. And in 1 minute more, the Queen was brought to herself by a great shout and a clapping of hands. They had found the princess fast asleep under a rose bush, to which the elvish little wind puff had carried her, finishing its mischief by shaking a flower of red rose leaves all over the little white sleeper. Startled by the noise the servants make, the princess woke, and, furious with glee, scattered the rose leaves in all directions, like a shower of spray in the sunset. She was watched more carefully after this, no doubt. Yet it would be endless to relate all of the odd incidences resulting from this peculiarity of the young princess. But there was never a baby in a house, not to say a palace, that kept the household in such constant good humor, at least below stairs. If it was not easy for her nurses to hold her, at least she made neither their arms nor their hearts ache. She was so nice to play at ball with. There was positively no danger of letting her fall. They might throw her down, or knock her down, or push her down, but couldn't let her down. It is true, they might fly her into the fire or the coal hole or through the window, but none of these accidents had happened yet. If you heard peals of laughter resounding from some unknown region, you might be sure enough of the cause. Going down into the kitchen or the room, you would find Jane and Thomas and Robert and Susan and all the sum playing at ball with the princess. And she was the ball herself, and did not enjoy it the less for that. Away she went, flying from one to another, screeching with laughter, and the servants loved the ball itself better than the game. But they had to take some care how they threw her, for if she received an upward direction, she would never come down again without being fetched. Chapter 5. What is to be done? But above stairs it was different. One day, for instance, after breakfast, the king went into his counting house and counted out his money. The operation gave him no pleasure. "To think," he said to himself, "that every one of these gold sovereigns weighs 1/4 ounce, and my real-live flesh-and-blood princess weighs nothing at all." And he hated his gold sovereigns as they lay with a broad smile of self-satisfaction all over their yellow faces. The queen was in the parlor, eating bread and honey, but at the second mouthful she burst out crying and could not swallow it. The king heard her sobbing, glad of anybody, but especially of his queen to quarrel with. He clashed his gold sovereigns into his money box, clapped his crown on his head, and rushed into the parlor. "What is this all about?" he exclaimed. "What are you crying for, Queen?" "I can't eat it," said the Queen, looking ruefully at the honey pot. "No wonder," retorted the king. "You've just eaten your breakfast. 2 turkey eggs and 3 anchovies." "That's not it," sobbed Her Majesty. "It's my child, my child." "Well, what's the matter with your child? She's neither up the chimney nor down the draw-well. Just hear her laughing." Yet the king could not help with a sigh, as which he tried to turn into a cough, saying, "It is a good thing to be light-hearted, I'm sure, whether she be ours or not ours." "It is a bad thing to be light-headed," answered the queen, looking with prophetic soul far into the future. "'Tis a good thing to be light-handed," said the king. 'Tis a bad thing to be light-fingered, answered the queen. 'Tis a good thing to be light-footed, said the king. 'Tis a bad, began the queen, but the king interrupted her. In fact, said he, with the tone of one who concludes an argument in which he has had only an imaginary opponent, and in which, therefore, he has come off as triumphant. In fact, it is a good thing altogether to be light-bodied. But it is a bad thing altogether to be light-minded, retorted the queen, who was beginning to lose her temper. This last answer quite discomfited his majesty, who turned on his heels and betook himself to his counting-house again. But he was not halfway towards it when the voice of his queen overtook him. I'm sure I don't know, said the queen, but might you not try an apology? To my old sister, I suppose you mean, said the king, returning. Yes, said the queen. Well, I don't mind, said the king. And so he went the next morning to the house of the princess, make him know it, and making a very humble apology, begged her to undo the spell. But the princess declared with a grave face that she knew nothing about it. Her eyes, however, shone pink, which was a sign that she was happy. She advised the king and queen to have patience and to mend their ways. The king returned disconsolate. The queen tried to comfort him. We will wait till she is older. She may then be able to suggest something herself. She will know at least how she feels and explain things to us, said the queen. Meanwhile, notwithstanding awkward occurrences and griefs that she brought upon her parents, the little princess laughed and grew, not fat, but plump and tall. She reached the age of 17 without having fallen into any worse scrape than a chimney, by rescuing her from which a little bird-nesting urchin got fame and a black face. Nor, thoughtless as she was, had she committed anything worse than laughter at everybody and everything that came her way. When she was told, for the sake of experiment, that General Clanrunfort was cut to pieces with all his troops, she laughed, and when she heard that the enemy was on his way to besiege her papa's capital, she laughed hugely. When her mother cried, she said, "What queer faces Mama makes! And she squeezes water out of her cheeks? Funny Mama!" When her papa stormed at her, she laughed and danced round and round him, clapping her hands and crying, "Do it again, Papa, do it again, it's such fun! Dear funny Papa!" And if he tried to catch her, she glided from him in an instant, not in the least afraid of him, but thinking it part of the game not to be caught. With one push of her foot, she would be floating in the air above his head, or she would go dancing backwards and forwards and sideways like a great butterfly. I'm so sorry, I've lost my place. Let's see. Please forgive me. I'll just carry on. It happened several times, when her father and mother were holding a consultation about her in private, that they were interrupted by vainly repressed outbursts of laughter over their heads, and looking up with indignation, saw her floating at full length in the air above them, whence she regarded them with the most comical appreciation of the position. One day an awkward accident happened. The princess had come out upon the lawn with one of her attendants, who held her by the hand. Spying her father at the other side of the lawn, she snatched her hand from the maid's and sped across to him. Now, when she wanted to run, her custom was to catch up a stone in each hand so that she might come down again after a bound. Whatever she wore as part of her attire had no effect in this way, even gold. When it thus became as if it were part of herself, it lost all weight for the time. But whatever she held in her hands retained its downward tendency. On this occasion, she could see nothing to catch up but a huge toad that was walking across the lawn, as if he had 100 years to do it in. Not knowing what disgust meant, for this was one of her peculiarities, she snatched up the toad and bounded away. She had almost reached her father, and he was holding out his arms to receive her and take from her lips the kiss which hovered on them like a butterfly on a rosebud, when a puff of wind blew her aside into the arms of a young page, who had just been receiving a message from His Majesty. Now it was no great peculiarity in the princess that, once she was set a-going, it always cost her time and trouble to check herself. On this occasion there was no time. She must kiss, and she kissed the page. She did not mind it much, for she had no shyness in her composition, and she knew besides that she could not help it. So she only laughed like a music box. Only in her laugh there was something missing. What it was, I find myself unable to describe. I think it was a certain tone, depending on the possibility of sorrow, perhaps. She never smiled. Chapter 7. Oh, I'm going to skip Chapter 7. Let's see. Gosh, I've done a bad job with my, Here we go. Chapter 8. Try a drop of water. Perhaps the best thing for the princess would have been to fall in love. But how a princess who had no gravity could fall into anything is a difficulty, perhaps the difficulty. As for her own feelings on the subject, she did not know that there was such a beehive of honey and stings to be fallen into as love. But now I come to mention further curiosities about her. The palace was built on the shores of the loveliest lake in the world, and the princess loved this lake more than father or mother. The root of this preference, no doubt, although the princess did not recognize it as such, was the moment she got into it she recovered the natural right of which she had been so wickedly deprived, namely gravity. Whether this was owing to the fact that water had been employed as the means of conveying the injury, I do not know, but it is certain that she could swim and dive like the duck that her old nurse said she was. But at the same time, she seemed more sedate than usual when she was in the water. Perhaps that was because a great pleasure spoils laughing. At all events, the passion of her life was to get into the water, and she was always the better behaved and the more beautiful the more she had had of it. Summer and winter it was quite the same, only she could not stay so long in the water, and when they had to break the ice to let her in. Another reason for her being fond of the water was that in it alone she enjoyed any freedom. For she could not walk out without a cortege consisting in part of a troop of light horses, for fear of the liberties which the wind might take with her, and the king grew more apprehensive with increasing years, till at last he would not allow her to walk abroad at all without some 20 silken cords fastened to as many parts of her dress, and held by 20 noblemen. Of course, horseback was out of the question, but she bade goodbye to all of this ceremony when she got into the water. Chapter 9. Put me in again. It must have been about this time that the son of a king who lived 1,000 miles from Legobel set out looking for the daughter of a queen. He traveled far and wide, but as sure as he found a princess, he found some fault in her. Of course, he could not marry a mere woman, however beautiful, but there was no princess to be found worthy of him. Perhaps the prince was so near perfection that he had to right to demand perfection itself. All I know is that he was a fine, handsome, brave, generous, well-bred, and well-behaved youth. In all his wanderings he had come across some reports about our princess, but as everybody said she was bewitched, he never dreamed that she could bewitch him. For what indeed could a prince do with a princess who had lost her gravity? So of course he had made no further inquiries about her. One day, though, he lost sight of his retinue in a great forest. One lovely evening, after wandering about for many days, he found that he was approaching the outskirts of a forest. Next, he came upon signs of human neighborhood. After traveling for another hour, his horse, quite worn out with long labor and lack of food, fell and was unable to rise again. So he continued his journey on foot. At length he entered another wood, a civilized wood, through which a footpath led him to the side of a lake. Along this path, the prince pursued his way through the gathering darkness. Suddenly, he paused and listened. Strange sounds came across the water. It was, in fact, the princess laughing. Now there was something odd in her laugh, as I have already hinted, and perhaps this was how the prince mistook the laughter for screaming. Looking over the lake, he saw something white in the water, and in an instant he had torn off his tunic, kicked off his sandals, and plunged in. He soon reached the white object and found that it was a woman. There was not light enough to show that she was a princess, but quite enough to show that she was a lady, for it does not want much light to see that. Now, I cannot tell how it came about, whether she pretended to be drowning or whether he frightened her, but certainly he brought her to shore in a fashion ignominious to a swimmer, and more nearly drowned than she had ever expected to be, for the water got into her throat as often as she tried to speak. At the place to which he bore her, the bank was only a foot or two above the water, so he gave her a strong lift out of the water to lay her on the bank. But her gravitation ceasing the moment she left the water, away she went up into the air, scolding and screaming. "You naughty, 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 naughty man!" she cried. No one had ever succeeded putting her into a passion before. When the prince saw her ascend, he thought he must have been bewitched, and have taken and mistaken a great swan for a lady. But the princess caught hold of the topmost cone upon a lofty fir. This came off, but she caught at another, and in fact stopped herself by gathering cones, dropping them as the stalks gave way. The prince, meantime, stood in the water staring and forgetting to get out. But the princess disappearing, he scrambled on shore and went in the direction of the tree. There he found her climbing down one of the branches towards the stem. But in the darkness of the wood, the prince continued in some bewilderment as to what the phenomena could be, until, reaching the ground and seeing him standing there, she caught hold of him and said, "I'll tell Papa." "Oh, no, you won't," returned the prince. "Yes, I will," she persisted. "What business had you to pull me out of the water and throw me to the bottom of the air? I never did you any harm." Pardon me. I did not mean to hurt you." "I don't believe you have any brains, and that is a worse loss than your wretched gravity. I pity you." The prince now saw that he had come upon the bewitched princess, and had already offended her. But before he could think what to say next, she burst out angrily, giving a stamp with her foot that would have sent her aloft again but for the hold she had of the prince's arm. "Put me up directly." "Put you up where, you beauty?" asked the prince. He had fallen in love with her almost already, for her anger made her more charming than anyone else had ever beheld her. "So, put you in where, your beauty, you beauty?" asked the prince. "In the water, you stupid," answered the princess. "Come then," said the prince. The condition of her dress, increasing her usual difficulty in walking, compelled her to cling to him, and he could hardly persuade himself that he was not in a delightful dream, notwithstanding the torrent of musical abuse above which she overwhelmed him. The prince being, therefore, in no hurry, they came upon the lake at quite another part, where the bank was 20 feet high at least, and when they reached the edge, he turned toward the princess and said, "How might I put you in?" "That is your business," she answered quite snappishly. "You took me out, put me in again." "Very well," said the prince, and catching her up in his arms, he sprang with her from the rock. The princess had just time to give one delighted shriek of laughter before the water closed over them. When they came to the surface, she found that she could not even laugh, for she had gone down with such a rush that it was with difficulty that she recovered her breath. "How do you like falling in?" said the prince. After some effort, the princess panted out, "Is that what you call falling in?" "Yes," answered the prince. "I should think it a very tolerable specimen." "It seemed to me like going up," rejoined she. "My feeling was certainly one of elevation, too," the prince conceded. The princess did not appear to understand him, for she retorted his question, "How do you like falling in?" "Beyond everything," answered he, "for I have fallen in with the only perfect creature I ever saw." "No more of that. I'm tired of it," said the princess. "Don't you like falling in, then?" said the prince. "It is the most delightful fun I ever had in my life," she answered. "I never fell before, I wish I could learn to think. I am the only person in my father's kingdom that can't fall." Here the poor princess looked almost sad. "I shall be happy to fall in with you any time you like," said the prince devotedly. "Thank you. I don't know. Perhaps it would not be proper. But I don't care. At all events, as we have fallen in, let us swim together." "With all my heart," responded the prince, and away they went, swimming and diving and floating, until at last they heard cries along the shore and saw lights glancing in all directions. It was quite late now. "I must go home," said the princess. "I'm very sorry, for this is delightful." "So am I," returned the prince, "but I am glad I haven't a home to go to. At least, I don't know exactly where it is." "I wish I hadn't one either," rejoined the princess. "It is so stupid. I have a great mind to play them all a trick. Why couldn't they leave me alone? They won't trust me in the lake for a single night. You see where that green light is burning? That is the window of my room. Now, if you would just swim there with me, very quietly. When we are all but under my balcony, give me a push, up you call it, as you did a little while ago, and I should be able to catch hold of the balcony and get in at the window, and then they may look for me till morning." "With more obedience than pleasure," said the prince gallantly, and away they swam very gently. "Will you be in the lake tomorrow night?" the prince ventured to ask. "To be sure I will." "I don't think so. Perhaps," was the princess's strange answer. But the prince was intelligent enough not to press further and merely whisper, as he gave her the parting lift, "Don't tell." The only answer the princess returned was a roguish look. She was already a yard above his head. So perfectly like other people had she been in the water that even yet the prince could scarcely believe his eyes when he saw her ascend slowly, grasp the balcony, and disappear through the window. He swam away quietly and watched the lights roving about the shore for hours after the princess was safe in her chamber. He soon found a spot whence he could see the green light in the princess's room, and where, even in the broad daylight, he would be in no danger of being discovered from the opposite shore. All night long he dreamed that he was swimming with the princess. Chapter 10. Look at the Moon. We're reading The Light Princess by George MacDonald. Early in the morning, the prince set out to look for something to eat, which he soon found at a forester's hut, where for many following days he was supplied with all that a brave prince could consider necessary. When he returned from his breakfast to his watch cave, he saw the princess already floating about in the lake, attended by the king and queen, whom he knew by their crowns, and a great company in lovely boats, with canopies of all the colors of the rainbow, and flags and streamers of a great many more. It was not till the sun went down that the gay party began to vanish. Boat after boat drew away to the shore, following that of the king and queen, till only one, apparently the princess's own boat, remained. But she did not want to go home yet, and the prince thought he saw her order the boat to the shore without her. At all events, it rowed away, and now of all the radiant company, only one white speck remained. Then the prince began to sing. Before he had finished his song, the princess was just under the place where he sat. "Would you like a fall, princess?" said the prince, looking down. "Ah, yes, if you please, prince," said the princess, looking up. "How do you know I am a prince, princess?" said the prince. "Because you are a very nice young man, prince," said the princess. "Come up then, princess. Fetch me, prince." The prince took off his scarf, then his sword belt, then his tunic, and tied them all together and let them down. The princess just managed to lay hold of the knot of money and was beside him in a moment. This rock was much higher than the other, and the splash and the dive were tremendous. The princess was in ecstasies of delight, and their swim was delicious. Night after night they met and swam about in the dark, clear lake, where such was the princess's gladness that, whether the princess's way of looking at things infected him, or he was actually getting lightheaded, he often fancied that he was swimming in the sky instead of the lake. But when he talked about being in heaven, the princess laughed at him dreadfully. When the moon came, she brought them fresh pleasure. Everything looked strange and new in her light, with an old, withered, yet unfading newness. The prince soon found out that while in the water, the princess was very like other people, and besides this, she was not so forward in her questions or pert in her replies at sea as on shore. Neither did she laugh so much, and when she laughed, it was more gentle. She seemed altogether more modest and maidenly in the water than out of it. But when the prince, who had already fallen in love, when he fell in the lake, began to talk to her about love, she always turned her head towards him and laughed. After a while, she began to look puzzled, as if she was trying to understand what he meant, but could not. But as soon as ever she left the lake, she was so altered that the prince said to himself, "Ooh, if I marry her, I see no help for it. We must turn mermaid and merman and go out to sea at once." Chapter 11. Hiss. The princess's pleasure in the lake had grown to a passion, and she could scarcely bear to be out of it for an hour. Imagine then her consternation when, diving with the prince one night, a sudden suspicion seized her that the lake was not so deep as it used to be. The prince could not imagine what had happened. She had shot to the surface and, without a word, swam at full speed towards the higher side of the lake. He followed, begging to know if she was ill, or what was the matter. She never turned her head or took the smallest notice of his question. Arrived at the shore, she coasted the rocks with minute inspection, but she was not able to come to a conclusion, for the moon was very small and she could not see well. She turned, therefore, and swam home without saying a word to explain her conduct to the prince, of whose presence she seemed no longer conscious. He withdrew to his cave in great perplexity and distress. Next day, she made many observations, which, alas, strengthened her fears. She saw that the banks were too dry, that the grass on the shore and the trailing plants on the rocks were withering away. She caused marks to be made along the borders and examined them, day after day, in all directions of the wind, till at last the horrible idea became a certain fact, that the surface of the lake was slowly sinking. The poor princess nearly fell out of what little mind she had. It was awful to her to see the lake, which she loved more than any living thing, lie dying before her eyes. It sank away, slowly vanishing. The tops of rocks that had never been seen until now began to appear, far down in the clear water. Before long they were dry in the sun. It was fearful to think of the mud that would soon lie there baking and festering, full of lovely creatures dying and ugly creatures coming to life, like the unmaking of a world. And how hot the sun would be without any lake. She could not bear to swim in it any more, and began to pine away. Her life seemed bound up with it, ever as the lake sank she pined. People said she would not live an hour after the lake was gone, but she never cried. Proclamation was made to all the kingdoms that whoever should discover the cause of the lake's decrease would be rewarded after a princely fashion. Now, the fact was that the old witch princess was at the root of the mischief. When she had heard that her niece found more pleasure in the water than anyone else out of it, she went into a rage and cursed herself for her want of foresight. "But," she said, "I will soon set all right. The king and the people shall die of thirst. Their brains shall boil and frizzle in their skulls before I will lose my revenge." She laughed a ferocious laugh. She went to an old chest in the room, and opening it, took out what looked like a piece of dried seaweed. This dried seaweed she threw into a tub of water. Then she threw some powder into the water and stirred it with her bare arm, muttering over it words of hideous sound and yet more hideous import. Then she set the tub aside and took from a chest a huge bunch of 100 rusty keys that clattered in her shaking hands. Then she sat down and proceeded to oil them all. Before she had finished, out from the tub came the head and half the body of a huge gray snake. But the witch did not look around. It grew out of the tub, waving itself backwards and forwards with a slow horizontal motion till it reached the princess. When it laid its head on her shoulder, it gave a low hiss in her ear. She started but with joy, and seeing the head resting on her shoulder, drew it towards her and kissed it. Then she drew it all out of the tub and wound it round her body. It was one of those dreadful creatures which few have ever beheld, the white snake of darkness. Then she took the keys and went down to her cellar, and as she unlocked the door, she said to herself, "This is worth living for." She descended a few steps into the cellar, and crossing it, unlocked another door into a dark, narrow passage. She descended a few more steps. If anyone had followed the witch princess, he would have heard her unlocking exactly 100 doors, and descend a few steps after unlocking each. When she had unlocked the last, she entered a vast cave, the roof of which was supported by huge natural pillars of rock. Now this rock was the underside of the bottom of the lake. Then she entwined the snake from her body and held it up by the tail high above her. That hideous creature stretched up its head towards the roof of the cavern, which it was just able to reach. It then began to move its head back and forwards with a slow, oscillating motion, as if looking for something. At the same moment, the witch began to walk round and round the cavern, coming nearer and nearer to the center every circuit, while the snake described the same path over the roof that she did over the floor. She kept holding it up, till at last the snake made a sudden dart and clung to the roof with its mouth. "That's right, my beauty," cried the princess. "Drain it dry." She let it go, left it hanging, and sat down on a great stone. Then she began to knit and mutter awful words. The snake hung like a huge leech sucking at the stone. 7 days and 7 nights they remained thus, when suddenly the serpent dropped from the roof as if exhausted, and shriveled up till it was again like a piece of dried seaweed. The witch started to her feet, picked it up and put it in her pocket, and looked at the roof. 1 drop of water was trembling on the spot where the snake had been sucking. As soon as she saw it, she turned and fled. Shutting the door in a terrible hurry, she locked it, and having muttered some frightful words, sped to the next, which she locked and muttered over, and so with all the 100 doors, till she arrived in her own cellar. Then she sat down on the floor ready to faint, but listening with malicious delight to the rushing of the water, which she could hear distinctly through all 100 doors. Chapter 12. Where is the prince? Never since the night the princess left him so abruptly had the prince had a single interview with her. He had seen her once or twice in the lake, but as far as he could discover, she had not been in at night any more. When at length he discovered the change that was taking place in the level of water, he was in great alarm and perplexity. He could not tell whether the lake was dying because the lady had forsaken it, or whether the lady would not come because the lake had begun to sink. But he resolved to know so much at least. He disguised himself, and going to the palace, requested to see the Lord Chamberlain. His appearance at once gained his request, but the Lord Chamberlain, being a man of some insight, perceived that there was more to the prince's solicitations than met the ear. So he granted the prince's prayer to be made shoe-black to the princess. It was rather cunning in the prince to request such an easy post, for the princess could not possibly soil as many shoes as other princesses. Soon the prince learned all that could be told about the princess. He went nearly distracted, but after roaming about the lake for days and diving in every depth that remained, all he could do was put an extra polish on the dainty pair of shoes that were never called for. For the princess kept her room, with curtains drawn to shut out the dying lake. But she could not shut it out of her mind for a moment. It haunted her imagination, so that she felt as if the lake were her soul drying up within her, first to mud, then to madness and death. As for the prince, she had forgotten him. However much she had enjoyed his company in the water, she did not care for him without it. But she seemed to have forgotten her father and mother too. At length, the lake was all but gone. Only a few of the deepest pools remained unexhausted. It happened one day that a party of youngsters found themselves on the brink of one of the pools in the very center of the lake. It was a rocky basin of considerable depth. Looking in, they saw at the bottom something that shone yellow in the sun. A little boy jumped in and dived for it. It was a plate of gold covered with writing. They carried it to the king. On one side of it stood these words: "Death alone from death can save. Love is death, and so is brave. Love can fill the deepest grave. Love loves on beneath the wave." Now this was enigmatic enough to the king, the courtiers. But the reverse of the plate explained it a little. Its writing amounted to this: if the lake should disappear, they must find the hole through which the water ran, but it would be useless to try to stop it by any ordinary means. There was but one effectual mode. The body of a living man could alone staunch the flow. The man must give himself of his own will, and the lake must take his life as it filled. Otherwise the offering would be of no avail. If the nation could not provide one hero, it was in time the whole nation would perish. Chapter 13. Here I am. This was a very disheartening revelation to the king. Not that he was unwilling to sacrifice a subject, but he was hopeless of finding a man willing to sacrifice himself. No time was to be lost, however, for the princess was lying motionless on her bed, and taking no nourishment but lake water, which was none of the best. Therefore, the king caused the contents of the wonderful plate of gold to be published throughout the country. The prince, when he heard it, sat down and thought, "She will die if I don't do it, and life would be nothing to me without her, so I shall lose nothing by doing it, and life will be pleasant for her as ever, for she will soon forget me, and there will be so much more beauty and happiness in the world. To be sure, I shall not see it." Here the poor prince gave a sigh. "How lovely the lake will be in the moonlight, with that glorious creature sporting in it like a wild goddess. It is rather hard to be drowned by inches, though. Let me see, that will be 70 inches of me to drown." Here he tried to laugh, but could not. "The longer the better, however," he resumed, "for I cannot bargain that the princess shall be beside me. For can I not bargain that the princess shall be beside me all the time? So I shall see her once more, kiss her perhaps, who knows, and die looking in her eyes. It will be no death. At least I shall not feel it. And to see the lake filling for the beauty again? All right, I am ready." He kissed the princess's boot, laid it down, and hurried to the king's apartment. But feeling as he went that anything sentimental would be disagreeable, he resolved to carry off the whole affair with nonchalance. So he knocked at the door of the king's counting house. When the king heard the knock, he started up and opened the door in a rage. But the prince was not in the least alarmed. "Please, your majesty, I'm your butler," he said. "My butler? You lying rascal, what do you mean?" "I mean, I will cork your bottle." "Is the fellow mad?" bawled the king, raising the point of his sword. "I will put a plug, in your leaky lake, Grand Monarch," said the prince. "Oh," said the king at last, putting up his sword with difficulty. It was so long. "I am obliged to you, you young fool. Take a glass of wine?" "No, thank you," replied the prince. "Please, your majesty, I have a condition to make." "Well, what is your condition?" growled the king. "Only this," replied the prince, "that, as I must on no account die before I am fairly drowned, and the waiting will be rather wearisome, the princess, your daughter, shall go with me, feed me with her own hand, and look at me now and then to comfort me, for you must confess it is rather hard. As soon as the water is up to my eyes, she may go and be happy, and forget her poor shoe black." Here the prince's voice faltered, and he very, very nearly grew sentimental in spite of his resolution. "Do you grant it?" persisted the prince. "Of course I do," replied the king. "Very well, I am ready. Go and have some dinner then, while I set my people to find the place." The king ordered out his guard and gave directions to the officers to find the hole in the lake at once. It was a 3-cornered hole of no great size. There was water all around the stone, but very little was flowing through the hole. Chapter 14. This is very kind of you. It is 8:54, You are listening to KTEC 89.5 Klamath Falls, K-Tech, OIT Radio. I am Bree. This is The Garden. I am going to go ahead and continue past my normal 9 o'clock time to finish reading you the last couple chapters of George MacDonald's The Light Princess. I'm on chapter 14, and the prince is about to save the princess. I wondered again if I said KTEC too soon. I'll say it again in a minute. Chapter 14. This is very kind of you. The prince went to dress for the occasion, for he was resolved to die like a prince. When the princess heard that a man had offered to die for her, she was so transported that she jumped off the bed, feeble as she was, and danced about the room for joy. She did not care who the man was. That was nothing to her. The whole wanted stopping, and if only a man would do it, why take one? In an hour or two more, everything was ready. Her maid dressed her in haste, and they carried her to the side of the lake. When she saw it, she shrieked and covered her face with her hands. They bore her across to the stone where they had already placed a little boat for her. The water was not deep enough to float it, but they hoped it would be before long. They laid her on cushions, placed in the boat wines and fruits and other nice things, and stretched the canopy over her. Over all. In a few minutes the prince appeared. The princess recognized him at once, but did not think it even worthwhile to acknowledge him. But how was he to be... Here I am, said the prince. Put me in. But how was he to be put in? I'll say it again. This is KTEC 89.5 FM in Klamath Falls. This is Bree, and you're listening to my 1-hour show, The Garden, about to go into the 9 o'clock hour. But how was he to be put in? The gold plate contained no instructions on this point. The prince looked at the hole, but saw but one way. He put both his legs into it, sitting on the stone and stooping forward, covered the corner that remained open with his 2 hands. In this uncomfortable position, he resolved to abide his fate, and turning to the people said, "Now you can go." The king had already gone home for dinner. "Now you can go," repeated the princess after him like a parrot, and the people obeyed her and went. Presently, a little wave flowed over the stone and wetted one of the prince's knees, but he did not mind it much. He began to sing a song. "Sing again, prince. It makes it less tedious," said the princess. But the prince was too much overcome to sing any more, and a long pause followed. "This is very kind of you, prince," said the princess at last, quite coolly, as she lay in the boat with her eyes shut. "I'm sorry I can't return the compliment," thought the prince, "but you are worth dying for, after all." Again, a wavelet and another flowed over the stone and wetted both the prince's knees. But he did not speak or move. 2, 3, 4 hours passed in this way, the princess apparently asleep and the prince very patient. But he was much disappointed in his position, for he had none of the consolation he had hoped for. At last he could bear it no longer. "Princess!" he said. But at that moment, up started the princess, crying, "I'm afloat! I'm afloat!" And the little boat bumped against the stone. "Princess," repeated the prince, encouraged by seeing her wide awake and looking eagerly at the water. "Well?" she said without looking round. "Your papa promised me that you should look at me, and you haven't looked at me once." "Did he? Then I suppose I must, but I am so sleepy." "Sleep then, darling, and don't mind me," said the poor prince. "Really, you are very good," replied the princess. "I think I will go to sleep again." "Just give me a glass of wine and a biscuit first," said the prince very humbly. "With all my heart," said the princess, and gaped as she said it. She got the wine and the biscuit, however, and leaning over the side of the boat towards him, was compelled to look at him. "Why, prince," she said, "you don't look well. Are you sure you don't mind it?" "Not a bit," he answered, feeling very faint indeed. "Only I shall die before it is of any use to you, unless I have something to eat." "There, then," she said, holding out the wine to him. "Ah, you must feed it to me. I dare not move my hands. The water would run away directly. Good gracious, said the princess, and she began at once to feed him with bits of biscuit and sips of wine. As she fed him, he contrived to kiss the tips of her fingers now and then. She did not seem to mind it one way or the other, but the prince felt better. Now, for your own sake, princess, he said, I cannot let you go to sleep. You must sit and look at me, or else I shall not be able to keep up. Well, I will do anything I can to oblige you, answered she, with condescension, and sitting down, she did look at him, and kept looking at him with wonderful steadiness, considering all things. The sun went down and the moon rose, and gush after gush of waters were rising up above the prince's water. They were up to his prince's body. They were up to his waist now. Why can't we go have a swim? Said the princess. There seems to be water enough just about here. I shall never swim more, said the prince. Oh, I forgot, said the princess, and was silent. So the water grew and rose up upon the prince, and the princess sat and looked at him. She fed him now and then. The night wore on, the waters rose and rose. The moon shone full on the face of the dying prince. The water was up to his neck. Will you kiss me, princess? He said feebly. The nonchalance was all gone now. Yes, I will, answered the princess, and kissed him with a long, sweet, cold kiss. Now, he said with a sigh of content, I die happy. He did not speak again. The princess gave him some wine for the last time. He was past eating. Then she sat down again and looked at him. The water rose and rose. It touched his chin. It touched his lower lip. It touched between his lips. He shut them hard to keep it out. The princess began to feel strange. It touched his upper lip. He breathed through his nostrils. The princess looked wild. It covered his nostrils. His eyes looked scared and shone strange in the moonlight. His head fell back. The water closed over it, and the bubbles of his last breath bubbled up through the water. The princess gave a shriek and sprang into the lake. She laid hold first of one leg, then of the other, and pulled and tugged, but she could not move either. She stopped to take breath, and that made her think that he could not get any breath. She was frantic. She got hold of him and held his head above water, which was possible now. His hands were no longer in the hole, but it was of no use, for he was past breathing. Love and water brought back all her strength. She got under the water, pulled and pulled with all her might, till at last she got one leg out. The other followed easily. How she got him into the boat she never could tell, but when she did, she fainted away. Finally, coming to herself, she seized the oars, kept herself steady as best she could, and rowed, though she had never rowed before. Round rocks and over shallows and through mud she rowed, till she got to the landing of the palace. By this time her people were on shore, for they had heard her shriek. She made them carry the prince to her own room and lay him in her bed, and light a fire and send for the doctors. But the lake, your highness, said the chamberlain, who, roused by the noise, came in his nightcap. Go and drown yourself in it, she said. This was the last rudeness of which the princess was ever guilty, and one must allow that she had good cause to feel provoked with the Lord Chamberlain. Somehow, the doctors never came, so the princess and her old nurse were left with the prince. But the old nurse was a wise woman and knew what to do. They tried everything for a long time without success. The princess was nearly distracted between hope and fear, but she tried on and on, one thing after another, everything over and over again. At last, when they had all but given up, just as the sun rose, the prince opened his eyes. Chapter 15. Look at the rain. The princess burst into a passion of tears and fell on the floor. She lay for an hour and her tears never ceased. All the pent-up crying of her life was spent now. The princess did not heed the lake. She just lay on the floor and wept. And when her weeping abated a little, and she proceeded to rise, she found to her astonishment that she could not. At length, after many efforts, she succeeded in getting upon her feet, but she tumbled down again directly. Hearing her fall, her old nurse uttered a yell of delight and ran to her, screaming, "My darling child, she's found her gravity!" "Oh, that's it, is it?" said the princess, rubbing her shoulder and her knee alternately. "I consider it very unpleasant. I feel as if I should be crushed to pieces." "Hurrah!" cried the prince from the bed. "If you've come round, princess, so have I. How's the lake?" "Brimful," answered the nurse. "Then we're all happy." "That we are all indeed," answered the princess, sobbing. And there was rejoicing all over the country that rainy day. There was such jubilation as was never heard before. And, of course, the prince and princess were betrothed at once. But the princess had to learn to walk before they could be married with any propriety. And this was not easy at her time of life, for she could no more walk than a baby. She was always falling down and hurting herself. "Is this the gravity you used to make so much of?" she said one day to the prince as he raised her from the floor. "For my part, I was a great deal more comfortable without it." No, that's not it. This is it," replied the prince as he took her up and carried her about like a baby, kissing her all the time. "This is gravity." "That's better," she said. "I don't mind that so much." And she smiled, the sweetest, loveliest smile in the prince's face, and she gave him one little kiss in return for all his, and he thought them overpaid, for he was beside himself with delight. I fear she complained of her gravity more than once after that, notwithstanding. It was a long time before she got reconciled to walking, but the pain of learning it was quite counterbalanced by two things, either of which would have been sufficient consolation. The first was that the prince himself was her teacher, and the second, that she could tumble into the lake as often as she pleased. Still, she preferred to have the prince jump in with her, and the splash they made before was nothing to the splash they made now. The lake never sank again. In process of time, it wore the roof of the cavern quite through, and was twice as deep as before. The only revenge the princess took upon her aunt was to tread pretty hard on her gouty toe the next time she saw her, but she was sorry for it the next day, when she heard that the water had undermined her aunt's house, and it had fallen in the night, burying her in the ruins, whence no one ever ventured to dig up her body, and where she lies to this day. So the prince and princess lived and were happy, and had crowns of gold, and clothes of gold, and shoes of leather, and children of boys and girls, not one of whom was ever known, on the most critical occasion, to lose the smallest atom of his or her due proportion of gravity. The end of The Light Princess by George MacDonald. Gosh, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I have enjoyed it. The end of it is a little bit perplexing. It is perplexing that the prince would want to give his life for her when she clearly didn't love him. She couldn't even stay awake in the boat. She couldn't return, even an ounce of his selfless love. And yet he was so patient with her and died so willingly for her and loved her so much. And you really would wonder, why did he love her? But I was pondering it, and I don't have a clear answer. But I thought maybe he loved her because he'd experienced her. He knew from being with her in the lake those many nights what she could be like when she did get her gravity. He saw that future with her, a woman with gravity. Of course, he died not knowing that he wouldn't need to really die, that he would come back to life in the story. But the idea that a savior would die for you, knowing what you could be like, not because of how wonderful you are already, but looking forward to the future. I also really liked at the end the princess's process of learning to walk, that she couldn't just walk right away. It was a painful process. Of course she stuck with it. Of course she did walk. But her delight in the learning process was that she got to be with the prince. And he gave her 1,000 kisses and was happy with just one in return. What a great love. So George MacDonald, if your appetite was whetted at all, I highly recommend his other books. I've read many of them, not all of them, and have been delighted again and again and again with his work. So thank you so much for listening tonight. It's been wonderful. Forgive my many radio faux pas. I appreciate your patience, dear listener. Until next Monday night, may our hearts and our minds be fertile ground. This is Bree, signing off. KTEC 89.5 FM, Klamath Falls.